Hello and welcome to The Game Changers, She Talks, brought to you by Credit Suisse. I'm Yvonne Chan. In 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as the agreed framework for international development, and it includes 17 objectives and goals to end hunger, poverty, inequality, and tackle climate change. Now, in this video, we shine the spotlight on Goal 5, gender equality. UN Women pointed out that gender equality would have a multiplier effect on all global goals. And one study of more than 1,500 global corporations found that compared to companies with less gender-balanced boards, those with more women board members offered more goods and services to communities with limited or no access to financial products. Well, the business case for gender-balanced leadership teams is already strong. Research shows that increasing gender diversity in leadership positively affects a company's performance and strategic direction. The Credit Suisse Gender 3000 report found that companies where women made up at least 15% of senior managers had 18% higher profitability than those where female representation was less than 10%. And what's more, companies with a female CEO experienced 19% higher profitability. Joining me today to talk more about gender equality in corporate leadership and women leaders in tech is Korean-American globetrotter So-Young Kang, a serial tech entrepreneur who is passionate about maximizing human creative potential. So-Young is the founder of an award-winning multidisciplinary transformation design firm, Awaken Group, that focuses on aligning people to strategy. She is also the founder and CEO of mobile micro-learning content app Nobi. 50% of Nobi's employees are female, and about 40% of the leadership team consists of women. Hi, So-Young. It's so good to have you in the studio here with me today. You know, you've spent over 20 years advising government and business leaders on strategy and innovation. So what have you observed in terms of female-owned companies demonstrating higher performance and also being more receptive to adopting innovative approaches at work?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's so great to be here, Yvonne. And you know, what I notice is companies that have more female leaders tend to be more open to listening to ideas and much more collaborative. So they're open to taking in inputs across. They don't need to be the smartest person in the room, even if they even if they are, yeah. Right? They are really open to listening. And innovation comes from having multiple diverse ideas, yep. Having different voices, and even diverse content and controversial. So whenever you bring these things together, it leads to more innovative solutions. So it makes sense that when women are more collaborative, compassionate, empathetic to the end user, you will start to see greater innovation, which ultimately leads to greater profit, greater strategic value, greater market positioning, competitive advantage, et cetera, et cetera.
Coming back to the tech space more broadly, have you experienced, gender bias in this industry? How do you think gender bias in the tech space differs from other industries?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I've been working for quite a while. I was at McKinsey, I worked at Citigroup, and I worked in Silicon Valley as well as in New York. And I actually never really experienced gender discrimination in most of my corporate career. The first time I experienced it was when I became a tech founder.
Tell me all about it right now.
Exactly. And so when you look at the stats, and the stats are less than 3% of female-led startups receive funding. It's micro, especially given half the population are women, right? And then that was pre-COVID. And then in COVID, there was tons of money poured into tech companies,
yes, right.
But the percentage of funding from women to female-founded startups was even less. So women took, was not impacted positively by the additional funding for female. So what's interesting is there is a definite level of unconscious bias. And so when I became a tech founder, despite kind of the experience I had had,
was it a rude shock for you?
It was. I study human behavior. I'm an executive coach as well as a facilitator. So I read nonverbal communications, right? I do that for a living, and so. The first time it happened to me at a networking event where basically they're just dismissive of you. And I'm not a young person. I don't lack confidence. I'm not a mousy person. I'm pretty
confident, eloquent.
I'm able to communicate, and I speak to CEOs. I work with board members around the world. So I've never had an issue having someone kind of pay attention to what I was saying.
Right.
So I had all these incidences where they would just be dismissive of what I was saying.
And what was that behavior that
So I'll give you a funny story.
Yeah.
So I'm at a networking event.
Yeah.
It's myself, an investor, and a guy who runs events for startups.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's not a tech founder. So the investor says, what do you guys do? I say, oh, I'm the founder of Nobi. We're innovating and disrupting the whole micro-learning space. He's like, oh. And he's like, oh, that's interesting. And I was like, and then he asks the guy who was with me, what do you do? He's like, oh, I run events. He's like, oh, that's cool, man. Tell me more about that.
No way.
And spent the next 15 minutes asking the guy about his events that he runs for startups.
So he wanted to engage the non-tech guy
Yeah,
more than
yeah.
someone who was actually deep in tech.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So that happened, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I'm just overly sensitive today. Went to another event, and it happened, and it kept happening over and over and over again. And so I was quite shocked by that. And but I know it's unconscious. So I couldn't, if I were to call the person out, it's not productive.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't realize he's doing it. There's just something in the unconscious bias of a tech profile. So there's a great book called Brotopia, which I would highly recommend people to read. Brotopia. And it was very interesting, and it went into why specifically in tech, these biases and these gender biases exist, because it has to do with recruiting and the bias in profiling.
Yeah.
That the ideal tech profile was a white male, a little bit nerdy, a little bit socially awkward. And so that became kind of the prototype.
Right.
And so when you start to then have biases in your hiring processes, it starts to then change the narrative of what a tech person should look and be like.
Got it.
And so that started to, and that's been, and the Brotopia talks about it in a brilliant way about the research, where it started, and how it actually has perpetuated itself.
Exactly.
Especially in Silicon Valley, that has perpetuated. I think Asia, honestly, has done better.
Okay.
In a really weird way when it comes to tech and females in tech. And I think Singapore has done that. I have never experienced that as a tech founder in Singapore, but I have experienced it as a tech founder in different parts of the world.
So it seems like gender bias in tech, it's not a perception, it is a reality.
Oh, 100%. Look at the data. Yeah. The data is like
2.3%. That was pre-COVID, right? And that's probably even worse, even more alarming. How hard was it for you then as a female founder to get funding compared to your male counterparts? Tell us about that journey.
Well, it's still a challenge, right? It's always a challenge to get funding. So I would say in the early days, a lot of my funders were people who knew me personally.
Okay.
And
so there was that connection.
So we already had the connection.
Yeah.
Because fundraising is like anything, it's network-based.
Okay.
It's about trust. So I don't blame, in some ways, some of the stats. Because if you had a relationship with some of the male founders before, then and those are the ones who got refunded during COVID. Because they had already had their relationships.
Yeah.
So when you ever have that bro thing where you've already known each other for a while, then there's trust, you know the person, you know their character, you know how they lead, there's reliability. So it reduces your risk as an investor.
Of course.
Totally get it.
Yeah.
The challenge is that even in the boardroom, a lot of the women are not in the room. And so when women are not in the room, they're not part of those conversations or the social networks.
Yeah.
And so the social networking is a critical part. That's one of the root causes of how and why females are not getting the roles. So people say, I don't know any female. I don't know people like that. Well, of course, or they don't exist.
Because they were excluded in the first place.
So they exist, but they're not part of your social network, then it's really difficult.
Right.
So I think for me, I think leveraging some of the networks that I've had, I've been blessed to have different networks, of investors and people that I've known who've known me for a while. So that was the early tranche. But I think as we grow and scale, I think it's been more challenging because now I have to go to networks of people I don't know.
Right.
And so when you do that, that's more challenging because then that credibility, the female thing definitely plays a role.
Coming to Nobi, because it's such an interesting micro-learning app. Did you consciously decide to have, half of your employees are female and about 40% of your leadership team is female? Was it a conscious decision to do that? Or you just naturally found the talent that you needed?
Yeah, I think it's more, I think it's more looking for the best people. And so because I don't have that bias, I look at what people can do, how they present themselves, and whether they can do the job.
That's fantastic.
And if you look at the general population, it would seem to make sense that about half of them should be women, if you're looking purely at skills and capabilities. So I think it's naturally happened, but then when you find out, but then what happens is when there is a bit of an imbalance, then we will look specifically for females.
Okay.
So we'll say, okay, guys, we seem to be a little bit out of balance here. Let's go look for a female.
That's a nice balancing act, right, that you have to tread. So how do you think we can better manage unconscious bias, especially in our organizations, our communities? What are some ways we can do to, just start chipping at this horrible glass ceiling? And also, I mean, given the fact that some observers have said that just to achieve gender parity is going to take like 170 years, which is so disappointing.
Yeah. So at WEF in Davos last year, I was at the Gender Equality Lounge, and it was basically 200 years before we're going to achieve it. So I actually created a program in NOBI for this topic.
Oh, okay.
About gender inclusion, and it includes activities and things to do. It's actually free. Okay. It's free, so I'm happy to share with the world.
Yes.
Yeah, it's free. I did it because I'm not trying to make money from that program. I really want to help address this issue. Okay. So some of the things that I included in there is more around observation.
Yeah.
So one of the activities is go into the next meeting, male and it's designed for men and women, not just for females, right? Because you need male allies.
That's right.
So you walk into a meeting and the activity says, go observe what happens when a female speaks and when a male speaks.
Okay.
And then, or go write down what happens, or go write down the number of times a female speaks up versus a male.
Okay.
And then observe the impact it has on other people.
I want to quickly come back to the CS Gender 3000 report, because in it also says that there was evidence that shows that if you were to increase the number of female in managerial positions, it actually boosts a company's performance capacity.
Absolutely.
And especially in the arena of handling complex issues. Is that your experience?
Well, the data speaks for itself. So in some of the stats, female-led companies or tech startups, 35% more profitable. And when I speak to my female tech founders, co-founders, the way we talk about business is actually very different. So there's complex issues. We will listen and we'll proactively say, okay, cross-functional teams.
Okay.
We'll bring them together to figure out how to solve the problem. And no one tries to take credit over the other person. So we're not like, okay, it's my idea and therefore, right? In order for ideas to be executed, you need people to buy into that idea and be able to execute and feel proud of what they've done. And so females, a lot of not all, right? Because sometimes some of the worst can be females as well. So it kind of goes on both extremes, right? But I think that the ones who are able to create this collaborative environment of cross-functional problem solving creates the ability to solve complex problems. No one person has the answer to every issue, right? And it's not about getting credit and being the smartest person in the room. It's about how do you work together to find the right answers. And we're talking about complex human issues. Those are the most challenging. And then with empathy, the ability to listen, then you start to understand what are some of those human issues, and that is absolutely critical.
That is such an important point that you just raised, right? It's, I mean, you want to have to get buy-in, you want the flourishing of ideas, so then it has a multiplier effect that everything, the company does better, everyone gets rewarded equally, and that's the kind of environment that you want. What else are you doing to empower the females in tech today?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things. I think one is, in some of the things I was talking about, these micro-learning courses. So we are encouraging, and we were just talking, about amazing programs that females are creating for branding, for confidence, for presentation skills, right? Which, obviously you're great at. And so I think having women create content, so training women on the mindsets as well as the behaviors. It's not just about watching videos. It's about changing your behavior in order to understand and raise awareness for men and for women. So I think that's one piece of area. I do a lot of kind of mentoring in general. I always say that I might be late or I might miss a call with a CEO or a client, but if it's a potential mentee who wants advice, I will always prioritize giving feedback, because I feel like they're the next generation. And we want to pour into them and give them some of the tips and tricks so that 200-year gap is short. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
It is. And I feel that you're from our sharing today, you're very generous and you're not selfish. Generous with your advice, generous with your time, because these things are really valuable.
They are valuable, but it's about the ROI. So it depends on how we think about ROI. I don't think of ROI as a short-term, this quarter-led performance. I think of ROI from a much longer-term perspective, for society, for humanity. And I also feel like females think a lot about that as well. So there is research that shows that if you invest in female, and these are in developing markets as well, that if you invest in female kind of startups, they will invest in education and healthcare for their families. And so it'll result in economic kind of growth, uplifting of the community. Whereas with men, sometimes, especially in some of these markets and communities, and not all, of course, will spend it on alcohol and gambling and some other things for themselves and for entertainment purposes.
Right.
So the same amount of funds will not be reinvested back into the family or into education, which is super interesting.
Yeah.
And so I think,
right
right.
there,
So when you think about ROI, it's really about thinking holistically about society and community. And so you're right, our time is very valuable. So where do I want to invest my time? I want to invest in things that I think will have a long-lasting impact.
And that is the next generation. So before we wrap, So-Young, what would you like to see happen for female tech leaders in the next 10 years? I know this might be a bit of a short time frame for you, 10 years, but let's talk about the next decade. What do you want to see?
I'd love to see just greater collaboration with corporates. And I think this is where, companies and banks like CS play a huge role in really supporting the female tech ecosystem, not just because we're females, but because the business performance and ROI has improved itself. We're also very capital efficient.
That's right.
So women are used to managing many, many things. We're multitasking all the time. So we tend to also be so we're able to get higher results with usually lower funds. So what I would love to see is greater collaboration between large corporates who don't just talk about, and I think this is an amazing initiative, but then put dollars and cents. Ultimately, dollars and cents is going to show where your priorities are. To see a greater number of female tech founders who are being funded, who are also being willing to be clients of, because clients are always better than funding, right? But willing to invest. And I don't believe in handouts, but they should be great companies with great products solving real problems and real issues, but a conscious effort because of the unconscious bias. You almost have to kind of counter unconscious bias with a conscious effort.
Counter unconscious bias with a conscious effort.
Yes.
I really like that. That is such a great rallying call. Last but not least, a final word of advice for other female tech leaders who maybe are faced with a lot of challenges right now. What would you say to them?
A lot of things. Hang in there. So I would say hang in there. I would say build allies and networks.
Because and the allies include male allies too,
of course,
right?
100%. So build allies at multiple levels. Step out of your box and build as many allies as possible, both in your context and outside your context, because we need a community in order to address some of these things. And this is not about a blame game. This is about how do we collaborate together to help everyone raise consciousness around these issues, and then be very intentional, about those networks and then bringing them together. And I think that's the only way we're going to address this together. It's not going to be a solo effort.
Yeah.
It's not about the men changing or the women changing. It's about how do we work together to build allies to do this together.
It really takes a village, doesn't it?
It
to
does.
Actually make a conscious change in society. And I do like what you said earlier, a conscious effort to get rid of that unconscious bias and to really be intentional about your networks. And also, you raised the very important point of having to build allies, men, females, just get more people to surround you, to support you, and then make that change together.
Yeah. Oh, I actually have one more thing.
Go ahead.
This is, and this is where I think women needs to promote other women.
Oh, women supporting women. Don't you love the hashtag? I actually think
great
things
it's so
do
important.
Happen. Yeah.
So important. Because sometimes we as women also have unconscious bias. So it's how do we also, women support women more and go out of your way to not compete with other women. Because there are so few women as it is. Let's not compete with each other. Let's support each other proactively. Let's lift each other up. Let's share those stories. Because the more stories we have in our LinkedIn feeds, in our Facebook that show female women, female leaders doing all these things, the better. The CEO of IBM is a female. The CEO of YouTube is a female. The CEO of Oracle are women. But we don't know them. We don't know their names.
No.
Right? So how do we promote that so we are all more familiar?
Sharing their stories.
Sharing their stories. Because I think as we share their stories, our stories will also be uplifted too in that process.
And I couldn't have said it better myself, summing up this conversation with a fantastic reminder of women supporting women. That was So-Young Kang, female tech leader, and a very inspiring conversation that we had today. Thank you so much,
thank
So-Young.
you so much,
It's been a pleasure
Yvonne.
speaking to you.
No, it was so fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you've been watching The Game Changers She Talks, brought to you by Credit Suisse. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.